Hi, I'm Dr. Roger Cohen. I'm going to talk today about this idea of just war, and I want to compare it to Jewish war ethics. So today I'm going to call this small discussion a survey of biblical, rabbinic, and modern perspectives of Jewish just war thought from Moses to the IDF. Granted, we'll give the caveat that just war theory is a Christian tradition, and we'll just see where they overlap and parallel. So we're going to spend some time talking about the tradition that gave us the Hebrew Bible. That's the idea of Judaism, and the most war-saturated text within this ancient literature, and look at the tradition that has gone on for 2,000 years without writing a single systematic treatise yet on ethics of warfare. So this is a pretty important topic. So we're going to look at eight different main categories. I'm going to call it from Moses to the IDF, and we're going to begin with what I call the core paradox. And it's this idea that a tradition rooted in one of the most militaristic scriptures in world history has managed to produce a culture of relative pacifism and nearly no systematic just war thinking for almost 2,000 years. So the idea of what just war theory is a developing concept. So getting that paradox clearly out of your mind and in your mind really early is a prerequisite. So we're going to move into biblical foundations. What does the Hebrew Bible actually say about the ethics of warfare? So, what does the sixth commandment in the tradition actually mean? What does Deuteronomy say? How war should be conducted? So these aren't simple questions, and they're not. They're answers that people may not expect. We're going to then go through rabbinic thought, uh, get in through some authoritative Jewish code, and then look at modern Zionism. So, um, this is the roadmap I want to look at on some of these ideas today. And so now we're going to lean into the first section here, one, the core paradox. So I have three cards up on your screen that we're looking at because they map this paradox. On the left, the war-like scripture. The Hebrew Bible, the foundational text of our Jewish civilization, is saturated with warfare in a way that only can be described as comprehensive. God does not merely permit the conquest of Canaan, God commands it. God specifies its targets. God promises divine assistance in battle and sometimes even provides it spectacularly. So, like the walls of Jericho being blown down by Shofar and Shofar Road. The hailstones at Gibeon, the Red Sea, these stories of military might. Military figures are among the greatest heroes in these traditions. Joshua, Gideon, David. These are not incidental characters. They are central characters to the story. They tell a motif of the story that's important. And perhaps most strikingly, God is repeatedly described as a warrior God or warrior, while Exodus chapter 13, we can see God is described through the Song of the Sea. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. It's not a metaphor. This is a theology for a God of a war God. So on the right, that we see of that square in the center here, we call the pacifist tradition for nearly 2,000 years from the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. The Jewish people lived in diaspora, no political sovereignty, no army, no military institutions, and the culture that developed in those 2,000 years was, on the whole, broadly pacifistic. Um, rabbinic literature prizes learning over fighting for millennia afterwards, and communal survival over the military glory was often written as important and within rabbinical literature. So, accommodation over confrontation became the modus operandi for this war ethic. And the great heroes of the diaspora period are not generals; they are scholars. So, by the time we look at this theological bridge, the key here, this is the gap between those things that we call the warlike scripture and the uh, pacifistic or pacifism and the pacifistic tradition. So it's not an idea that there's a failure going on. The growth of this was not an intellectual contradiction that the tradition simply never got around to evolving. It was theologically meaningful in its posture. War, in the rabbinic understanding of history, belonged to certain specific moments: the original divinely commanded conquest, the future messianic era, and at the time, the defense of the community under moral attack. So, as people were attacked, how they defend themselves. So for many long centuries in the diaspora, none of these conditions applied. And so the tradition kept waiting to develop and kept developing, and it has preserved many relevant texts, and it did not develop them into systematic doctrine. It deferred developing out doctrines of just war theory. So this idea of deferral is what we're looking at is the deferred sovereignty of defining what is and understanding everything that is just war theory within Jewish development and Jewish textual development. So these biblical foundations are going to be looking right now at the first major sections, called as biblical foundations of maybe Jewish just war theory. And we have to understand the primary sources that actually contained these just war theories. And we have to have a careful, honest reading of the most contested texts within the Hebrew Bible. So we'll look at a linguistic question as well, because that changes our mind when we start to look at the linguistic questions. So we look at first the idea of the sixth commandment, one of the very often cited pacifist texts, the idea of wrongful or unauthorized killing within a person, murder specifically, for not killing in general. The idea within the sixth commandment is not do not kill on a broad-based idea of pacifism. It was translated wrong. So the sixth commandment, as everyone knows it, from the just war theory idea of complete absolute pacifism, says thou shalt not kill, if we were quoting, let's say, a King James version. And in the traditional Christian translation of the King James, which is the most common English version used for pacifism, it reads exactly that way: do not kill. Problem is that under modern linguistics approach, we can see that that translation is probably pretty wrong. It is wrong. It's not subtly wrong. It's fundamentally wrong, and that provides enormous problems on just war theory when it's translated wrong. So the Hebrew meaning here, at the root of it, is very intentional, means do not kill. In general, it refers to specifically to wrongful, unauthorized, or deliberate killing of something that we would call murder in today's modern sense, and more importantly, in today's moral sense. There is a difference between killing and murdering, and the Hebrew language has other words for killing, like harag, which means to slay or to kill, nakah, which means to strike down, and these words are used throughout the Torah to describe legitimate killing. Killing in warfare, like capital punishment or self-defense, without any suggestion of transgression, um, have a different meanings from what is modern pacifism has been using. So the commandment in the sixth commandment, do not kill, which should be reading as do not murder, and it uses the terminology for uh, murdering. So the distinction was recognized by the rabbis very early on, and its implications are profound. The sixth commandment prohibits murder, wrongful killing, rather than killing as such, then presupposes that the existence of rightful killing does exist. And then a legal category of killing is and does exist, becomes an appropriate under certain moral or rabbinically permitted situations. So self-defense, capital murder, capital punishment administered by a poorly constituted court, or killing in legitimate warfare, usually are outside the prohibition within Jewish law. So this becomes extremely important when we start to discuss the idea of war as a divine justice. The Hebrew Bible does not present God as a pacifist. There'll be many people who will present God as a pacifist. The Hebrew Bible presents God as a warrior and a warfare that serves as the vehicle through which divine moral order is enforced in history. In the conquest of Canaan is explicitly presented in Deuteronomy, not as a mere military aggression, but as the punishment of wicked people. It is not because of your righteousness, God tells Israel, that you are going to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving out before you. These verses become problematic for some, especially in absolute pacifist theory. But this is critically important. The prophetic tradition immediately introduces a counterweight. Isaiah chapter 2 says, They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. The messianic vision is of this version is a vision of universal peace. War in this framework is a temporary condition of a broken world. The Isaiah text is not a permanent feature of divine will, but even the Talmud preserves the tradition when it talks about the Egyptian army drowned in the Red Sea, that God rebuked the angels who began to sing, My creatures are drowning, and you want to sing songs. So even the Talmud starts to look at having some sort of idea of violence as a temporary solution for the immediate wrong going on. So we have from the very beginning this tradition and a productive tension with itself. There's a permission for legitimate killing and a deep moral discomfort with violence on the other. So there is an idea that both strands do run together, even in early rabbinical thought and development of intellectual thought from Judaism. Deuteronomy chapters 20 through 25, we start to see the biblical laws of war developing. So the most developed set of rules about how to conduct warfare in the Hebrew Bible is found in Deuteronomy, particularly chapters 20 through 25. These chapters constitute something genuinely remarkable, an attempt in the ancient world to impose legal and ethical constraints on military behavior. So there's a shift out of Mesopotamian cultural and insight and to where people are asking these ideas of how do we wrestle with lex talionis and eye for an eye. And there is this idea of having restraint pacifism developing early within these texts. So Deuteronomy 20, verses 5 through 8, start with before going into battle, the officers are required to exempt from military service anyone who has recently built a house and not yet dedicated it, planted a vineyard and not yet enjoyed its fruits, or betrothed a woman and not yet married her. So there begins these uh, exemptions, the things that are outside of requirements for um, for service and military conquest that are important. So it also goes on to say that there's a remarkable provision that says anyone who is afraid and faint-hearted should also go home. Uh, so, when you start to see these texts about military duty and not fighting because of fear or anxiety, so these are not modern ideas that we start to see. The army has no total claim on you that you have freedom and autonomy to choose fighting. Deuteronomy 20 verses 10 through 14 give us this framework of um, when you approach a city, you must offer it in terms of peace. If they accept the peace, then it becomes subject to forced labor. But if it's not, but it's not destroyed. But if it refuses, you can lay siege on it. You can kill the males, and then even then, women, children, and livestock are to be spared. So there is a non-combatant status between women, children, and livestock that is different than, let's say, a warrior class of men to which you're sieging. Um, so we see the most extraordinary provision of Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 through 20. When the besieging a city, you are forbidden to cut down the fruit trees even. This is really interesting because the texts give you a remarkable reason. Are the trees people that you should besiege them, and that the fruit trees are innocent? Destroying them serves no military purpose. So there are ethics and rules around destruction of mass destruction of property. Um, and then Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 through 18 presents a counterweight, the total destruction of Canaanite nations. So in no terms, no sparing, complete annihilation. And in this idea of complete annihilation, is it right? Is it just? The rabbis were troubled by this too, and they developed sophisticated strategies to contain it, and their answers how do you ethically and morally have a complete destruction of something and have it as a just war? So this development is a uh, shift of time for contemporary understanding as well. So moving through time, people are developing their understandings through time. So this develop of thought also started to go into rabbinic thought. So the rabbinic era emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and became the dominant form of Judaism for next 2,000 years. But they had no army, no state, no political sovereignty, so therefore warfare was also theoretical for the rabbis. Um, and that leads into some of these ideas of self-defense that are theoretical because they have no standing theocracy. So, from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin 22, if someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill them first. It's a remarkable statement written by scholars who were themselves powerless in diaspora. These rabbis who wrote this had no army, no political sovereignty. They prized learning and accommodation over conflict, but they preserved and developed a clear, unambiguous doctrine of lethal self-defense. So this idea of a just war was developing not just as a permission to have a first strike, but also an obligation. So to defend yourself by a first strike. The rabbis derived this principle from an unlikely source, the biblical law of the housebreaker in Exodus 22. That says if a thief breaks into your house at night and you kill him, you are not liable. Because the assumption is the nighttime intruder is a mortal threat to you. From that provision, the rabbis extrapolated a general principle. When someone poses a clear and present mortal threat to you, you may kill them preemptively, and you must. So this becomes a very interesting development for a just war doctrine from the rabbi period because the rabbis have extended this into two clear directions that they're critical for developing their view of what is a just war. One is the defense of others. It's called the Ro Rodef. And the pursuer, if you see one person pursuing another with an obvious intent to kill, you are legally obligated to intervene. So this doctrine of having a moral obligation to intervene is you must use lethal force to stop an attacker and save an intended victim who is being victimized. So it's not permission, it's a commandment. The second is the collective self-defense. The rabbis recognize that self-defense principle applied to communities as well as individuals. And a community under attack is obligated to defend itself, and the members are obligated to participate in that defense. So there's an idea of an obligatory war, and that obligatory war is really good. The rabbis did impose constraints on the permissions, the principle of Pekua Nefesh, the preservation of life, which is one of the highest values in all of the rabbinical system. It's capable of overriding almost all other commandments, including the Sabbath observance, as long as you're doing something for the benefit of life. But it cuts both ways. If you preserve one life and the life's a benefit of innocence, but it prohibits needless taking of lives as well. So the idea of self-defense within just war is and limited of proportionality becomes the main factor here. Is the rabbis were thinking about proportioned just war theory within this. We see later development of Rashi and the Rambam, Maimonides, and the two greatest thinkers of all time in this era, developing out ideas of just war theory. And for Rashi, just war theory is the codification and development of a distinction of earlier Talmudic discussion and the command or obligatory war and discretion of discretionary war permits so you have things like national interests, strategic advantage that are important, etc. Uh, Rambam on the right, out of his view, is the first his treatment of the laws of war, and it's called the Law of the Kings, is a systematic just war code in the pre-modern Jew tradition. So he uses Rashi's taxonomy in a precise legal detail, and he then establishes codes of war, which is the open path doctrine. If you lay siege to one side and allow citizens to flee to escape, You have non-combatant protection. Then he has the mass destruction problem of that um, um, he looks at discussing is how do you have a mass destruction or isn't even incapable, and then um, these two these two theories keep developing what we call a longer timeline um, and ethos that starts to develop. So from them, we start to look now to the nation state of Israel that starts to be created by 1948. So you have this long timeline between the great thinkers and what happens by the nation state of Israel. So the the bottom left, we have Joseph Caro's Code of 1565. It says it gives us the developmental guideline for understanding Jewish law, but it leaves us with this idea between Rashi and Rambam that there's still no virtually moral framework on how to have war. And the laws of war were legally not concurrently applicable. And so, without a Jewish sovereign state, the Sanhedrin and an army, war law had no practical domain. And then this three oaths in Ketubot 111a started to look at political self-assertion is, well, can the Jewish ethical tradition turn inward and start to look at its statehood reasons for having just war or protecting spiritual resources for the vulnerable? And what are all of these ethics towards protecting people who have a stateless protection? So these two big questions about how do you fight, or is there an obligation to protect those who can't fight, really frame this turn that we have coming up into the modernity. Because what do you do when people attack you and you are stateless? And that's where we are turning right now, the modern times. So Zionism, statehood, and the IDF start to rise. The idea of just war in Judaism from was just a theory of people living within other nations, and because there was no military force for 2,000 years, no state, etc., that would have to develop out this idea of a just statehood theory. So, in the first block, we're going to call it the Zionistic Challenge. Zionism is the movement for the reestablishment of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Um, and it became many different things at once. And it becomes very many different responses also to anti-Semitism. So it was a response to anti-Semitism. It was cultural and national revival. It was a political movement. It was also a deep level, a challenge to the theology of pacifism and diaspora. For Theodore Herzl and Ben Gurion, the existence on waiting for divine redemption while pogroms continued on in Europe and anti-Semitism was hurting people. That was not a theology. They wanted to act and help people. So with pogroms and with the Holocaust, there was an idea for turning away from military powerlessness and providing some sort of recourse for being powerless. And in the block two, we see what's called the Zionist vision of the new Jew, which this is the physically strong, politically assertive, military capable, rooted in the land, stood in deliberate contrast to what Zionist intellectuals characterize as a stereotypically passive, accommodating person in diaspora Jew. So military capacity in this new framework was not something to be feared, but deferred. It was a dimension of human dignity. The pre-Jewish state militias like the Haganah and the Irgun operated without any systematic ethical framework beyond immediate military necessity. And but then these Jewish ethics of war started to really arise when we start getting into the block three. 1948, Ben Gurion declares the independence of the state of Israel. Within hours, five Arab armies attack Israel, and the Israeli Defense Forces are created as the unified military of the new state, absorbing and reorganizing all the pre-state militias and for the first time in almost 1900 years, since the fall of the last Jewish military force in Masada, Jews had an army. And the urgent practical question within that tradition was been deferred for all time, and suddenly they demands an answer. What does Jewish law say how a Jewish army should fight? So, the creation of the IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force Rabbinic, had the chief rabbi of the IDF who had authority over religious matters affecting soldiers and the institution. The acknowledgement that the new Jewish army required Jewish religious guidance, and the first person appointed to that was 31-year-old rabbi named Shlomo Goren, and he was about to do something extraordinary while he was being appointed. The first chief rabbi of the IDF, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, was born in Poland, immigrated by mandatory Palestine as a child, ordained as a rabbi, served in the Haganah before 1948, became the first chief rabbi of the IDF the year Israel was founded, and served in that role through the War of Independence, the Sinai Campaign, and the Six-Day War. He was present at the Western Wall when Israeli paratroopers reached it in 1967, blowing the shofar at the moment that it became one of the defining images of that war. He served as the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel as well. So he was, by any measure, the most consequential Jewish legal minds and helping develop out a systematic Jewish ethics of war, almost from scratch, using classical sources that hadn't been applied to practical military situations for 2,000 years while he was there. So the framework that Goren gives is four pillars. One is the upper left pillar. We'll call this the prohibition of discretionary war. He read Maimonides carefully and drew a conclusion that it was both legally rigorous and politically significant. Discretionary war was a war of choice, required the approval of the Sanhedrin of 71 judges. The Sanhedrin, though, was dissolved in the 5th century, and the priestly oracle disappeared at the destruction of the temple. So, therefore, Goren concluded discretionary war is impermissible for the state of Israel, a pre-Messianic state operating without an institutional structure that Jewish law requires, and cannot undertake a war of territorial expansion. Um, and it was a substantive legal constraint to the entire range of wars that permitted the Jewish state to operate legitimately. The second pillar is the upper right, obligatory war. The flip side of the restriction is clear that an expansive affirmation of any other category, that defensive war against existential attack is not merely permitted, is religiously commanded. So if there's an existential problem to your existence that you have to fight in order to survive. It falls not only on the military, but in extreme cases on every single Jew to fight en masse. The third pillar on the lower left, the 1967 Six-Day War, was as a preemptive defense. This is where Goren's application of the classical principle to a modern situation was most interesting. Israel struck first in June 1967 because Egypt had closed the Straits of Tiran, expelling UN peacekeepers and mass borders of the border, and Nasser was publicly calling for Israel's destruction. So Goren argued that under those circumstances, the principle of rise up and kill them first applied, not just to an individual facing danger, but the entire nation. So this preemptive military action was not an aggression, it was allowed for self-defense. So pillar 4, which he developed, was called purity of arms. This is his most lasting contribution to the practical ethics of the IDF. It says the principle that weapons may be used only to achieve the military mission, not for vengeance, not for plunder, not to punish civilian populations. And for Goren went even further. He said a soldier who deliberately kills non-combatants, even enemy non-combatants, is not fighting for a mitzvah for good. He is committing murder. So this was Goren's framework. It was elegant. It was rigorously grounded in classical sources, and it became the groundwork for the future IDF, and what the IDF has been working with ever since. So there are a lot of contemporary debates. Is there a Jewish just worth thought? So Goren's framework did not end the conversation. It started it. It's developed. So don't think that that was the end. The settler movements after the Six-Day War, with the occupations of different lands and the growing expansionism into different lands. So nationalism and nationalistic settlers, all of these ideas over what is politically desirable, what is allowed, how much, what are you allowed to do over land expansionism. And then after you saw the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, things became muddy. They became unclear because is what happens when a democratically elected leader is murdered, and what is the religious obligations back because of that? So the second questions of war that people want to bring up right now with the asymmetric warfare right now in Gaza and Lebanon have all kinds of intense debate within Jewish law. Some authorities insist to protect innocent life. It applies to non-combatants, and others argue that there's a blurred distinction. And you hear the discussions of what do you do with human shields? The IDF Code of Conduct by 1994 lists purity of arms, human dignity, and the non-combatant protection as most important. So if I map here the spectrum of Jewish just war authorization, you can see there is a spectrum. War is always a means and never an end. And even doing good to have peace and justice requires some sort of authorization. And even necessary war carries a moral cost. So Judaism forbids the celebration of an enemy's deaths and requires acknowledgement of the weight. So four key takeaways. The diaspora silence for thousands of years um, was intentional, not a failure. It was deferred sovereignty, not intellectual vacancy, because people lived under different um, uh, statehoods. Rabbinical and rabbinical resources are more substantial than 2 millennia, and middle-aged thinkers started to develop out their own thought processes that have influence today, but don't have the same weight with the nation state. Goren's reconstruction was a foundational achievement and remains the architect for military ethics and modern abuses like the assassination of Rabin show how categories can be weaponized and how precise contextual reasoning still matters to this day. I know it's a long lecture, and I do thank you for tuning in. In the end, we have to say that the Jewish idea of a just war theory is developed differently than Christian just war theory, and in the end, what we see is a divergence, but also the end goal of both to protect the statehood.